Hey everybody, Professor Snart just checking in as we look at moving out of the Victorian period. Again, we just skim through these entire literary eras. We look at a couple of ideas and a couple of different authors, and then we're off to the next thing. So we move into units 11 and then 12 will follow, but they're really connected in terms of sort of introducing us to the next literary period, which is modernism, and then we look at W.B. Yeats, which is one of these figures a little bit like Thomas Hardy or Joseph Conrad, who really straddles the very tail end of the Victorian period and introduces us to a more kind of modernist period of literature. And again, you know, the uh, designation of these literary eras is often just arbitrary or related to non-literary events. So it's no surprise that we find often authors who are really have one foot in one literary era and another foot in the next one. Although it is useful, I think, to identify those authors whose careers sort of span that particular time period, but whose work also reflects changing ideas about whether it's content, but also just sort of the style of the way that literature is written or presented, or that the author kind of presents him or herself, as far as how the role of the poet, if you want to think of it that way, or the role of the author, really does change in literary periods, whether it's the romantic notion of the poet as this very solitary sort of figure, even if that's just the role that they play and not the actual fact of it, the role of the artist as uh, almost like social activist, like we would see in the Victorian period, or that emphasis on uh, nonfiction prose, like we found with Matthew Arnold, for example, although he too was also a poet. And then we move into the modernist period, which is again seeing a different role for the artist and a different sensibility being communicated. So for us, bundled together are really units 11 and 12, sort of introducing us to the modernist period. We'll start by looking at Yeats and then move into T.S. Eliot, really the quintessential modernist. And then we'll continue for a couple of units actually looking at other sorts of modernist authors who are certainly part of the modernist period, but for each of them, that idea kind of plays out in different ways. Someone like Virginia Woolf is really fascinating, because if you didn't sort of put her into the modernist period just because of when she lived, her birth and death dates, um, she could in many ways fit anywhere because of the sort of breadth of intellectual material she covered, the experimental approach she took, her involvement with artists as publisher, not necessarily always as writer. So she, again, is almost like a literary era unto herself, but we'll get there in time. So for modernism, what we've, again, it's such an oversimplification, but it really works quite nicely to look at a famous poem by Yeats called The Second Coming. And there's a couple of lines from that poem about um, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. And those become really sort of emblematic for the fundamental kind of condition that's communicated through modernist art, or literature specifically, but really art generally. This notion that the ways that we had organized culture around institutions or sort of central stable ideas, whether those would be governmental or, if you want to call them corporate, that's a little more of a contemporary term, but this notion that the British Empire was like this center that would kind of regulate civilization throughout the world, and of course do so by communicating all that was best about British civilization to everybody else. That would sort of be the foothold or the grounding point, the center that made the rest of the world make sense, no matter how barbaric that world might be. Um, but there were so many sort of historical events that began to unfold towards the end of the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th, which is really where we begin the modernist period, that all of those centers, they began to fall apart as these sort of footholds or strongholds of cultural stability. So even again, that a figure like Conrad writing against empire in something like Heart of Darkness really begins to point to how this idea of uh, the British Empire, imperialism, as this mode of kind of civilizing the entire world, really had some fundamental flaws in it and was beginning to expose those fundamental problems. And people began to realize that this notion of civilizing uh, the dark cultures of the world was really this brutal, violent use of those people as labor and the resources of the land that they lived on, and sort of decimating cultures around the globe. So that center began to fall apart, as did so many others. There's revolutions in Russia, for example. There is really the big one is World War I, and this sort of decimation of people and the landscape because of that trench warfare. It just became this very physical sign that all of these beliefs that people held in the sort of rightness of culture and these institutions that communicated ethically correct behavior and people sort of bought into, there's just no way that those could have produced World War I, and yet there it was, literally scarring the landscape. Um, so World War I happens a little bit later than what we would date as the very start of modernism, but that marks the period that all of that sensibility of the center cannot hold really comes into sort of crystal clear definition for so many poets and artists. And that's why in, for example, 1922, post-World War I, we find some of the most complex expressions of this sensibility that the center cannot hold in something like T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, experimental fiction coming from Virginia Woolf. James Joyce's Ulysses is published in 22. So 1922 is sort of this amazing year of the publication of modernist works, but it doesn't mark the beginning of modernism. It really marks a sort of high point in terms of art's reaction to this idea that's expressed much earlier in Yeats's work, that the center cannot hold. So what do you do in that situation? So we'll look then at modernism, we'll look at Yeats, and then we'll also begin to move into people like Eliot and Woolf and Joyce, all as a sort of package deal that we look at as we begin to get into this new literary period that, of course, will move us into something that's a lot more contemporary, whatever you want to call it, postmodernism, or just sort of where we're at right now with what artists and writers are doing.